One of the best things about, coming from astronomy to data science is that you have a really cool backstory. Having studied something interesting is actually like a cool thing to be able to say like you've done. It offers like kind of like a diversity of perspective as opposed to just being like all about the business all the time. You're seeing like, oh, there are like other pieces of this, pieces of like why would you ever write like a line of code or do an analysis? It's not just to make money. I think the other good thing about getting a PhD in anything, but especially like the hard sciences, it shows that you've done a really hard thing in a technical way. You've accomplished this huge thing. You've introduced this new piece of information that's never been known before. You've done it. You've become the world's leading expert in at least one thing. In order to be able to do that, you have to have a lot of qualities about yourself, right? You have to have some amount of grit to be able to get through it.
Welcome to the Astronomers Turned Data Scientists podcast. I'm Joseph Ahern, been a data scientist for over 2 years.
And I'm Jeff Silverman, and I've been a data scientist for coming up on 8 years now, getting close. And with us today is a good old friend of mine and former boss of mine, Julie Hollek. Welcome.
Hello, I'm Julie Hollek, data scientist in 9 years? Yeah. I was like, how does math work? And how does time move? And like that Jeff says, we know each other from many past lives at this point.
Great. Do you want to start by telling us about getting into astronomy?
Sure. So I think the thing that drew me to astronomy was almost more like the process of doing science rather than the subject matter, which I think is like maybe a little bit weird. I think most people are like, oh, wow, like the night sky in my backyard, it's so wonderful. But like I grew up in the suburbs and it was really bright. So I didn't have that experience. But in high school, I had a really excellent like chemistry teacher, and she also just happened to run the school's planetarium. And she had a radio astronomy team, and it was like one of only like a handful of schools that had a radio telescope, like high schools. And so she was connected with NOAO. And at the time, there was like this program called the Research-Based Science Education Program. And she had like teams of students. Some of them were building the radio telescope and trying to get to first light. And then other students were doing research. And like the research aspect was like really intriguing. And she was just like such a wonderful mentor to me. And like I wanted to like kind of spend more time with her because she was somebody I could tell like I could learn a lot from. And so it was like she just happened to be like really into astronomy, and we had the planetarium. And so it was like a good experience. And so the first thing I got to do was like look at novae. That was such a long time ago. I was like, I don't know, 15 when I did this. And just like, looking to try to like detect them manually, like, just like looking at two different images. And then the next year, Ribsy opened like observing proposals. And so like we submitted a proposal because like my teacher had seen this thing about really old stars. And so I'm from Michigan, and there's a professor at Michigan State. So he's like local, who to me at the time was in the field. And so like it was kind of, we could talk to him, and like, everybody was like, how about a high schooler? It looks good. And so my proposal got accepted. And so I got to like observe on Kit Peak. And that's when I became a spectroscopist, like when I was like 17. And so after that, I was like, okay, this is like super cool. Observing was great. I competed in science fairs. I got like a good chunk of my college education paid for through the winnings. That was cool. I have a nice, beautiful piece of copper that I won from like the Michigan or Science Teachers Association award that's like somewhere in my house that I've taken like home to home with me. So then in undergrad, I knew I wanted to go into astronomy. That professor who was at Michigan State was still there, so I went to study under him as an undergrad. And then like kind of like the natural evolution, all stellar spectroscopists end up at the University of Texas. So that's how I got into astronomy. I mean, it's true. We all know it's true.
Says you. That's fair. So yeah, you're in grad school at UT doing metal poor stars spectroscopy, as I know we've talked about many times. And so that's where we first met. You were finishing up your PhD. I just gotten there as a postdoc. And then I believe you went right into a data science role right after PhD. Is that correct?
Sort of, not quite.
Okay.
So for the end of like grad school, I kind of knew that like probably going into astronomy like really wasn't like what I wanted to do. And the thing that kind of scared me about like data science, because like everybody started being like, okay, let's like talk about dice problems and like stats questions about like decks of cards. Although I a little bit think that one of the reasons for that was like one of my classmates like got into professional poker playing eventually. So like anyway, but like they were all like what it felt like to me like really good at astronomy, and I felt like I wasn't. And so I wasn't sure that I wanted to do data science because it's like, well, if like they're all interested in data science and they're good astronomy grad students and I'm a bad astronomy grad student, then like how can I get into the same thing that they're getting into? And so when I graduated, I actually went to a coding boot camp. It was called Hack Right Academy. It was like aimed specifically for like women trying to get into like software engineering roles, especially really junior ones. And so like internet friend of a friend kind of like gave me an intro. And so I got in there and it was like web development. So I learned Flask and like kind of just like more and just like Python, which like some people were starting to learn as I was like finishing up grad school, but I was still firmly in the Fortran 77 camp, which is like an interesting place to be at that point in time. And so the boot camp was kind of like nice because it gave me an introduction to like Python, but then also doing things not in Fortran, which was like almost more important than Python. And it gave me like a real confidence boost. I feel like after your PhD, you kind of get beaten down by the world. You're like, what do I know? I know nothing. But this is like, wow, Python is like easy and it like does stuff for you, unlike everything else I've been doing in grad school. And so I did this boot camp and they had a career fair at the end of it. And so like they hook you up with like companies and like whatever. And so I interviewed with a company and they're like, we want you to talk to our data scientist too, because we noticed you have this like PhD. And I'm like, yeah, I'm like, but I just did this boot camp. They're like, yeah, but the PhD was like 6 years. So like you should talk to them. It's like, okay, sure. And so I talked to them and we talked about like an ad tech attribution problem. And it was like super interesting. And so I got a job offer for like both like the data science role with their research science team, and then also a full stack developer. And they're like, well, like if you do the full stack developer route, like you start at CSS and you work your way backwards. I hate CSS like from the bottom of my heart. Like that GIF of like Peter Griffin with like the trying to open like blinds in CSS. That's how I feel about CSS. It was like this is my kryptonite. And so I was like, okay, yeah, this data science role sounds like way better. And I actually think it was like a good choice for me because it sort of like fit, like kind of like how I like think about the world. And it meant that I didn't have to do like CSS and HTML, which was a blessing to everybody.
So that was the first position that you got in data science. And then what has been your career progression since then?
Yeah. So ironically, that company was called New Star since I studied like old stars. And so like at one point I went to Grace Hopper and I had like a roundtable discussion from old stars to new stars. It was about getting into tech, which is kind of like an interesting discussion. And honestly, the most interesting part about it was like the title. I did like a couple things. So I was like an IC. I did like a lot of like entity resolution, ad tech work, which was like interesting. I think ad tech gets like kind of a bad rap for being like, soulless and like whatever. And like, yeah, it's true. And like, ruining everything. But also there's like a lot of data. And so there's like a lot of cool things that you can do in ad tech with that amount of data and different like methodologies that are like developed for ad tech, but then you can use them for other things too. But people are willing to spend the money and time to like do them in ad tech because it makes them money, presumably, as opposed to like some of these other things that are like considered like cost centers. And so like entity resolution is like this kind of like interesting topic where it's like you have a bunch of pieces of information about like one or maybe many people. And then it's like, how do you like get down to like one entity and like put the right information in the right places? I think like a great example is like on iMessage or whatever. If you have like an email attached and a phone number for the same person, do they resolve to the same like contact or are they separate, right? Like that's like an entity resolution problem. So I worked on stuff like that at New Star, and then afterwards I like left that company and I worked at Twitter. And Twitter was like a really interesting time. I was there from 2016 to 2020. And I worked for the most part while I was there on what Twitter called health. Facebook calls it like integrity. it's anti-spam, anti-abuse, kind of like making Twitter a better place, like a more usable place. And like trust and safety, like I think is probably the most like common like overarching term. Entity resolution is super important in that field. And so it was kind of like cool way to like sort of bring something from like the first job, which is like ad tech or whatever, and like, but like this technique that like, helps like people make money, also actually helps identify like bad actors on the internet who are like popping up with like multiple accounts or like connected and clusters trying to do bad things and stuff like that. So I did like a whole lot of stuff at Twitter that was related to like, for the most part, trying to get bad people to stop doing bad stuff in the areas of like abuse and like hateful conduct, like hate speech kind of stuff. I did like some machine learning ranking of like reported tweets. And it's like if you want to spend like a summer being really sad, you can read all of the reported tweets that came in from Twitter. Ooh, it was not I had to, yeah, it was not like the happiest thing I've ever done. But it was really interesting and it felt like important. And like we were doing things that like made a difference for the users, which was like great. I was there for 3.5 years or a little bit more than that. Beginning of 2020, I was like ready to like kind of move on and make a change. And also honestly, just stop looking at like neo-Nazi content on the internet for like just a little bit. And so I moved to Mozilla, where I was a manager, and I started out building out the business data science function. So it's like revenue and like search, and then like a metrics team. And then at some point, it kind of became more like data product where we're thinking about trying to do like sort of more data powered products that like were user facing. And so like the team did some sort of like greenfield exploration around like what could this look like, and how do we do this in a way that is like deeply respectful to user privacy, which is like always a top concern at Mozilla. And then at some point, this kind of like became sort of like kickstarted like efforts around like ML ops and like other like infrastructure pieces, where if we were to get serious about it, we would need. And then I had a surprise pandemic baby, so I took parental leave off. And then when I came back, I had an opportunity to work on some stuff like around social media again, because Mozilla was like investing in that or exploring it. And so it's kind of cool to like kind of go back to my roots and see if there are different ways that we could do things that I had done before. And yeah. And then after that, I kind of had the choice of staying in that space and doing like less technical, more like product development work, or the director of data science position opened. And so then I took that. And so I recently left Mozilla and have been honestly just like hanging out for a beat. And this is like, I think I realized the longest break I've taken since like the gap between high school and college. So it's been nice to hang out.
Oh,
So I want to get back to the gap discussion a little bit later, but first I want to get back to something that I think we've talked to a couple of our guests about, but I know you obviously started off as an IC, an individual contributor, data scientist, senior data scientist, and then while at Twitter became a manager, and then I believe have been in people management roles and leveled up, senior manager up to director since then. And so I'm curious, what was that transition like? Was that something you always knew you wanted to do? Are you interested in looking at IC roles again, or sort of, how has that gone in your head these days, or over the last few years, actually?
Yeah. So I always kind of liked mentorship as a notion. So like I got into astronomy because like I had a really amazing mentor. And so it's like the kind of opportunity to like be in the other side of it like was always like really appealing to me. And so when I had the opportunity to do that, I would. And so in my first job, even like when I'd been working for about a year, I got like an intern. And so we worked on a problem together and it was like, cool, we have a blog post that may or may not still exist somewhere on the internet. And like that was like kind of like sort of my first taste of like management, I'd say. And then when I went to Twitter, I had another intern, and that was like even more kind of like management, like the way that Twitter's at that time program was set up. And so that kind of like made me really want to like explore it like more officially to like have an actual report. And so right after I got an intern, I got a head count. And so it was cool because like it's not management isn't just like telling people what to do. There are like so many other components of it. And so there's like the recruiting aspect. And I really like that because like as both like a woman and a person of color, like in a technical field, it's like, like there's not a lot of people that are like me. And so having the opportunity to recruit and hire gives me like, the power to try to like change that in whatever way I can. So that was like also like kind of like an exciting aspect of it that like, again, it's like as an IC, obviously you can have like a voice and you can like, make change. But at the end of the day, the hiring manager is the person who's doing the hiring. And so like at some point I just started kind of acquiring more reports. And then it kind of got to the point where it's like my title changed from like data scientist, like IC to like manager. And so it was something where it's like I kind of just like happened, but I also sort of knew that like it was maybe better suited to how I think about things. Like I can be the most technical person in the room if I need to be, but like it comes at like a greater cost than like some other people. But like I think that like in many situations, I can be the person that like communicates to like other people about like technical topics and the kind of like liaise between like less technical people and then like more technical people who might do like the hands-on keyboard thing. And so like the notion of being a multiplier was something that has like always been appealing to me. And so the manager to director path was like a little bit more like like every step you take, you get farther away from like the hands-on keyboard work and like closer to sort of the business needs. And that was like a really interesting kind of path to take because like sometimes it's like the business needs are like you have to like sort of at that point it's not like right or wrong, right? It's like if you have like a method or an equation, it's like this is either like correctly done or not correctly done. But like at some point, like when you're starting to think about the business needs, you have to like start to get more like subject matter expertise and like what your company is like doing. And like you have to really believe in it because otherwise like you're not going to be able to like motivate your team and allocate resources in ways that kind of like make sense. And that becomes like kind of like the big challenge. So you move from like technical problems to like really deeply people problems and getting like the right people in the right places. I think, oh, and you're asking, I don't know if I would want to be an IC again, maybe. I think that I wouldn't mind being like a player coach type person in the right circumstances. But like honestly, at this point, I'm kind of just like trying to figure out what am I finding interesting? Like what's like motivating? What am I passionate about? And then sort of like going from there. It's funny, I was talking to somebody recently, and it's like you can play it like one of two, like many different ways. So you can play it like in a numbers game and just like mass apply to places and just go where you get in first. It's like, or you can kind of like stop and try to figure out like what is your win condition from working at a place? And that's sort of more the approach that I'm taking. But I'm not quite sure exactly what my win condition will end up being. And so that's sort of where I'm at right now in terms of like, where in the data space do I want to live?
I'm trying to understand this concept of the win condition that you're talking about. Do you think you could give like an example?
Yeah, it's like every job you have, like you get something of it. It might literally just be like a paycheck and like health insurance. And honestly, those are super important, right? If like you're at the point where it's like, what do I need out of work? It's like money, like to like live. Yeah. And then like it's important to like get that out of a job, right? But like I think for me, like I'm fortunate to be in a position where I can like take like a little bit of a pause to sort of figure out what is it that I want. It's like, what do I want out of my next job? Do I want experience? Do I want things to put like what are the kinds of things I want to put on my resume? Is it about tech leadership? Maybe. Is it about technical expertise? That could be another like path that I take. Is it more about like, being like a product leader or like, like helping be part of like a like impact to like an emerging business? That's like another kind of thing. Because like I think all of these different scenarios like underlie like a certain experience that you have that you can bring to like kind of like your next gig. And so it's like I think at first when you get started, you kind of just like need to get going and get your foot in the door and like also like make money and pay off your student loans and like whatever. But like once you're like kind of at a point in your career where you've been doing it for a while, and I guess I've been doing it for almost a decade, oh my God, it's like, what am I doing? What am I doing here? And it's like, what do I want to do next? And like, how do I use my next position to kind of get to my end goal?
Yeah, I talk to, people coming out of academia looking for their first job in tech or first data science related role. And, I try to point out that there's, lots of different axes in this high dimensional space of jobs, right? There's types of companies and size of company and all of that stuff. But then there's also, sort of what you're saying, Julie, the experience you want to get out of it, whether it's just, I need to maximize salary because I need money right now. Like that's valid. If you want to optimize that axis, that's a way to go. And, you can do that when you're applying for jobs and what you're looking at. And we've talked, just about every person on the podcast has said, that first job out of academia is always the hardest to get. Maybe you can't quite optimize as strongly as you might want to for certain things, but that's sort of part of the deal. But once you get that first job, the second job, you can do a lot more optimization. And I think that's true, as you're alluding to, sort of as you get deeper in your career, you've got more varied experiences, you can talk to more topics, and you have more in your resume. You can optimize more strongly for certain things and more precisely for certain aspects of careers and new roles and jobs. You talked a little bit about doing coding boot camp and sort of the job fair and connections that got you in to your first role. I also went through one of the data science boot camps, the Insight one. I know a number of people who've done that. I know a number of people who haven't gone through any kind of boot camp and got pretty great first jobs out of academia. So I'm curious, from the people that you've hired and your personal experience, Julie, is a boot camp worth it, right? I mean, I think it depends is the answer, like lots of things. But I'm curious what you got out of your experience and sort of what advice you might give to people who are like, hey, should I do a boot camp? Should I just cold email companies, et cetera?
I think that the boot camp landscape has changed dramatically since 2014.
Yeah.
I did a boot camp and I lucked into a data science position. Like I did a boot camp for people who developed like web apps in Python. Like there's no world, I think, in which anybody would get a data science job coming out of that boot camp. I think it would be like a really hard sell. That said, I think because people saw kind of like how lucrative boot camps were to set up, like you pay, you charge people some amount of tuition, and then like you like sometimes like you double dip in that like you work with companies and you get a job placer fee or whatever. A lot of boot camps kind of cropped up, a lot of like for-profit education companies like have also, and institutions like have invested in boot camps too. And so I think the meaning of a boot camp certification has been diluted a little bit, or maybe a lot of bit. And so some boot camps I think absolutely make sense. Like Insight is one that kind of has always made sense to me because I see it as like a finishing school and a place to get connections. What did I get out of my boot camp at the end of the day? It was connections. 100% it was connections. It wasn't necessarily anything I learned. Like I learned Python 2.7 in that boot camp. Like no, like I don't know. And in some ways, like it was good. The other important thing that I got out of the boot camp aside from connections was like having like a place where I could like learn something in a safe environment and like kind of feel accomplished again. Again, like I mentioned earlier, like getting a PhD breaks you as a person a little bit. And like this was like kind of like the first step in a long road of like repairing my like self-esteem. And so it was great. It's like, oh, this is actually like pretty easy. I can do this. It's like it's nice. They have a random function. I don't have to invent it on my own. I've noticed like a couple things kind of coming out. One is like now all of a sudden there are data science degrees, which to me is like kind of like weird because it's like data science is like a business thing. It's not like a science, right? Like you're not like proving a theorem about like anything, right? Like you're trying to make a business more money, which is like great, whatever. It's like needed in the capitalist society we exist in. That said, studying it is like a little bit strange because it's like almost like it's without context. And so like I think when I've seen people with like data science like undergrads, they've never necessarily done super well on the sorts of like interview loops I've led because like it is so without context, right? I think the boot camps are nice from a networking perspective. I think like I wouldn't not hire somebody who's a boot camp graduate, but it's not the kind of like automatic entry that I think it used to be in the first place. that said, it's like one of the best things that you can do is like have connections. And so like you can do that through like bootcamp for sure. You pay for it, like literally, like with money, or you can do it, like knowing people, going to meetups, like making connections that way. But like I think it's like a little bit tricky to like it's not like the surefire thing that it was in years past. I also think the other thing that's like interesting is like data science as a field is changing dramatically. And it's like it used to be like it's like saying you're a data scientist now is like kind of like saying like I'm an engineer. It's like, well, what does that mean? Could mean like literally anything. Usually front end, back end. I could be like DevOps. Like all these like people are like called engineers. And so like now when you say you're a data scientist, what does it mean? And so in job descriptions and like if you look at like things that are like available, it's fracturing, right? You have like ML engineers, you have ML ops, you have infrastructure engineers, you have analytics engineers, you have like, data scientists, you have product science, you have decision science, you have data analyst, right? You have like all these different names for things that like before used to just be data science. And like before that, it was like research science or it was like software engineer or like whatever, right? And so I think like sometimes like some of the boot camps you have to be like really careful about the ones that you attend and like understand like what you're it's the same thing like for like what job do you get next, right? And maybe even more important, it's like what am I getting out of this? Because like with a job, it's like, okay, like I'm spending my time, but like with this boot camp, you're like literally spending money to attend, right? And so it's like, what are you getting out of taking the time to do this and paying for it?
Earlier, you mentioned people who get a data science degree, and when you talk to them in interviews. So on the flip side, what is the major advantage of people who come from astronomy then? Is it just like the idea of the subject matter that they're studying and everything that goes into that they solidify in addition to the statistics knowledge and the programming knowledge? And so in that case, maybe it doesn't have to be astronomy, it could be any subject matter. Whereas a data science degree, maybe they're switching contexts so frequently when they're practicing the statistics and programming skills that that doesn't get developed. Is that what you had in mind, or is there more to it?
I think that's like part of it, right? So first, one of the best things about, coming from astronomy to data science is that you have a really cool backstory. And I mean it jokingly, but also kind of mean it seriously. Like in that, like I think that like having studied something interesting is actually like a cool thing to like be able to say like you've done. And I think like it offers like kind of like a diversity of like perspective as opposed to just being like all about like the business all the time. Kind of seeing like, oh, there are like other pieces of this, like pieces of like why would you ever write like a line of code or do an analysis? It's not just to make money, actually. I think the other kind of good thing about getting a PhD in anything, but especially like the hard sciences, is that like it shows that you've done a really hard thing in a technical way. It's like you've accomplished this like huge thing. You've like introduced this new piece of information that's never been known before to like the universe. And like, you've done it. Like you've become the world's leading expert in at least one thing. And not that you have the opportunity to do that in industry a lot, but like in order to be able to do that, like you have to have like a lot of like qualities like about yourself, right? You have to like have some amount of grit to like be able to get through it. You have to like be able to like know how to learn things like on your own, have to like be able to like communicate like what you've learned to like various things. Like especially things like in astronomy, it's like there's so many proposals, like everything's a proposal, right? It's like I want telescope time, or I want time in the supercomputer, or I want like whatever, like right. And then after that, it's like you have to communicate it to the public, right? You can't just like sit in your like hidey hole and it's like now I know this thing and nobody else like gets to know it either, right? You have to like communicate that as well. And I think like having those kinds of experiences like lend themselves really well to industry. I also think like especially and I say this like as an like a former observational astronomer, I would go outside and I would take what the night sky gives me. And then I'd have this like messy data set. Most of it was garbage. But I had to like figure out how to like weed through that and like mine that data for science or for physics, right? Like in industry, there's like so much of that. And I think astronomy in particular, because like there's so much of it that's like observational and not experimental, like an industry that actually like helps you a lot because like you can't set up these like perfect A/B test experiments like all the time in astronomy the way you can with like, like other things. It's perfectly as an A/B test like can never be run, right? But like, and so like I think astronomy gives you kind of that like dirty data, like hands-on with like dirty data and data wrangling and like whatnot that like is like not super unique to astronomy, but like a little bit. The other place I've seen people do this is like cognitive neuroscience. Like people who do fMRI stuff, they make good data scientists too. And I think it's similar reasons.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's the kind of one of my standard answers when people, ask me, yeah, why do I think astronomers make good data scientists? And it's like, well, many of them get messy data sets and look for signal above noise. And that's like what astronomers do and what the vast majority of data science jobs end up
Yeah.
being. So yeah, there's that. So I want to switch gears a little bit. And this is personally for me very interesting because we haven't talked much about this over the years, but I'd love to hear. I know you're one of the main organizers of the SciPy conference. And so I'd love to hear how you got into that, what you do with that now. That's definitely a much bigger and more established conference and community than the small and 7-year-old ATDS community, but we definitely aspire to be as big as the SciPy conference one day. So yeah, I'd love to hear how you got into it and yeah, your experience working with that group.
So the SciPy conference 4 years was at basically held on campus at the University of Texas. So like where I went to grad school. And so it was like kind of an easy thing for me to just like go to because like in Austin, but I somehow never made it while I was in grad school. But like the first year I was working, my colleague was like, "Oh, I'm going to the SciPy conference," or I went to the SciPy conference last year. It was great. Like, do you want to go? And I was like, "Yes, I do," because it like would get me back to Austin. I could hang out with people, like that kind of thing. So she ended up not being able to go, and so I just kind of went, and like it was great. And so one of the things that I noticed though was like I was like, wow, there are a lot of women here, are there? Huh? And so I kept emailing like the conference like logistics person. I didn't really know anyone there or whatever. And I just like, kept asking like, do you have your diversity stats? Like how many women are here? Like are there like any outreach things you're doing? Like how do you think about it? Right. To the point where she finally was like, do you want to be on the organizing committee? And so the next year I joined the organizing committee. And at that point I was like communications and I was diversity because like they were trying to recruit a bunch of different people and those were two separate committees, but then I became the committee. The year after that, at least we got to like separate out the communications and diversity. And so every year since then, I was just kind of like moving around different committees. So I was on the diversity committee for many years, organizing that and like trying to set it up, and it's like the early days of the conference, it was like, hey, of all the keynotes you've had over the last 12 years, you've had two women speakers as keynotes. Like come on. And so like kind of trying to change like the culture there. The other thing that I did in tandem with like being more involved is as part of the DISC committee out of Num Focus. At the time, Num Focus like wasn't associated with the conference, but like they like are kind of like an administrative like nonprofit that helps like open source projects like do like business stuff basically and so they had a disc committee and like, we'd have early conversations about like, how do you run conferences that are like inclusive, basically. And so there's like a discovery cookbook was basically like, how do you run a conference? And a lot of that was like kind of born out of like stuff that we were doing in the SciPy conference. So we would do things like collect diversity stats and like report on them. We would do things like reach out to like underrepresented or underserved really communities like by the SciPy conference. And so I worked on that stat like for a few years. I worked on BOF's Birds of a Feather, which is kind of like, I don't know, unique to SciPy, but it's like, I think kind of like a unique part of the conference where folks come together and like have like either like roundtable discussions, like in a big room. One year there was a BOF about color maps for Matplotlib. That was incredible. And I think the year after that, they like came out with Viridis, which is like a really nice color map. What other committees are there? I was on the program committee for a beat as well. And that was one year. And that was interesting because it's like curating a conference and like what are the different things we're going to see. And that year I was on the program committee. And I was like also very pregnant. and I was like very tired. And I was like, I think this is the last year. I need to take a break from organizing for the SciPy conference. And so I was like, I'm going to step back. This is like in 2022, and my baby was like weeks old by the time the conference happened. And then like a month later, I got an email from one of the conference co-chairs asking, do I want to co-chair the entire conference? And I was like, oh, yeah, I think I do. Like, wait, I thought I was going to take a break, but like not yet. Well, so something that I think that SciPy does that I really love, and I think I encourage every kind of conference to like conference organizers to do this, is like we try to like have like some sort of like continuity of like information. So it's like you don't have to start from scratch every time. And like this seems like really obvious, but SciPy does this in like a pretty intentional way, especially with the conference co-chairs, and that people serve 3-year terms. It's not just like 1 year that you're the chair. So it's like, and they're overlapping. So I'm in my 3rd year as conference co-chair, and we brought on a new conference co-chair who's awesome. And I was lucky. I got the lucky term because like I had 2 years with somebody who had done it before. Unfortunately, my co-chair, she only gets 1 year with me, and then like we'll find another co-chair. And that way it's like the conference doesn't get stale, but it has enough kind of like continuity that like we can kind of like bring it into, it's not like reinventing the wheel every time we have a conference. The other thing that we did recently that I think was like really tricky was we moved the conference from Austin to now we're in Tacoma. And so we were there this summer. We'll be there next year. It's very exciting. And a lot of it had to do with like the community. And so I think a big part of organizing a conference is listening to community and what the community needs. And a lot of people, for like very, I think, legitimate reasons, did not feel comfortable traveling to Texas. And they wanted to be in a place where they felt safe, where they felt like they could just focus on science and not about anything else. And so we moved the conference. And so that was like a big undertaking. And then also our institutional sponsor or organizer changed. And so it was previously like a company. Now it's a nonprofit that runs it, and this is non-focus that I was talking about before. And so kind of going through like a lot of that change has been like an interesting part of the conference. And so we've had to do these kind of like logistics, like under the hood kind of things that like if we don't get right, we don't have a conference. But then like also keeping the spirit of the conference and like why people like nobody is like excited about going to the conference because like we figured out how to bring breakfast tacos to Tacoma, right? But like it's an important part of the culture of the conference, right? And like the logistics of like feeding people and like whatever. People are excited to go see your keynote speakers, to go to tutorials and like the talks and stuff. So yeah.
I was trying to go to that conference in Tacoma because it's actually closer to where I live than my work.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
yeah, and my I talked to my boss, and then he talked to the director, and then it was a matter of does the whole team want to go? And then we looked at the schedule, and we're looking at, yeah, this would be interesting, but on this day maybe there isn't anything. And so in the end, it just kind of fell through, and like none of us were able to go. And I was a bit disappointed about that. But knowing that it's going to be in Tacoma regularly, maybe I can figure out a way that maybe, this day, even if my company doesn't pay for us to go, maybe I'll just go on my own that day or something like that.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
we'll figure that out. But
Yeah. I'm really excited about being in Tacoma. I think the convention space is like really nice, like kind of like setup. That's like another thing too that I think people don't think about, like from a logistics standpoint. Where we were in our previous conference center, it was great for a number of different reasons, but it was terrible for one specific reason. And it's like the grand ballroom was in the basement, like 2 floors down and across. And if you wanted to get to 2 different talks that were one was in the grand ballroom and another one was like in the other place, sometimes you couldn't even with like 10, 15 minutes in between, like you'd have to like book it like up multiple flights of stairs, and it's like in Texas in like the middle of July and like whatever. And so the conference center like was like laid out really nicely. And so we really liked it. We thought it was like a great like venue. And so yeah, I would love to see astronomers come. Like astronomy and physics tends to be a track that we have, not necessarily every year, but often and often enough where we see like really interesting talks. Who was the guy? Leo Sanger? Neutron star, collision guy. Gravity waves. Sorry. The gravity waves. Like he gave a talk about gravity. It was like amazing, like getting to see that talk. And so we've had like really prevalent like a like talk at SciPy, and we see like there's some like Python packages SciPy packages that show up too. And so I actually think it's like a really relevant conference for astronomers. And the proceedings that we have, like we have a proceedings and like you get a DOI, and so it's like super like legit. We have our proceedings up with Curve now. We've been working with them and they're so cool. Like I know it's like a weird thing to like geek out about. It's like our proceedings are awesome, but no, our proceedings are awesome. And like they're like interactive, like you can like upload like a Jupyter notebook. A lot of like the SciPy stack, like like people do things in Jupyter and people like do widgets. You can like interact with them. It's like it's super cool. And so I got to like see kind of like where the proceedings are and just like sort of like go through them, and it's like really neat. It was earlier today. And so I think there are like a lot of things that like astronomers could get out of just like coming to the conference. Yeah.
Kind of curious what your sort of general pitch is to a business. I mean, Joseph sort of hinted at this, that, maybe the leadership of his company was a little bit skeptical about, sort of the return on investment for sending folks, not just the cost to get in, but the loss of hours of work time, right, for the company.
Yeah.
I think you've made a good case for academics, astronomers, detailed coders, maybe people more on the hobby side, perhaps, but like, how do you pitch it to a business that wants to make money, and it's like, okay, how do I convince the leadership to send some data folks to this conference?
I think there are a few different ways that you can do this. Like one, if you have a learning and development budget, it's like absolutely appropriate. One of the most unique things about the SciPy conference I've seen, and I'm saying this as a both biased person, but also as a person who goes to a lot of conferences, I've never seen quite the confluence of academia, industry, and government in one place. And we try really hard to curate talks where we're not like listening to sales pitches, but rather like people like building tooling or showing results. And so something that I think is interesting is like every year I've been able to bring something back to my companies and be like, hey, look at this thing that like I learned at the SciPy conference. And it gets used and implemented in some way, shape, or form, which is pretty rewarding. We typically have 2 feature tracks and then like kind of more like regular tracks every year. And so like this past year, our featured tracks were about like playing nice across programming languages and then machine learning, data science. And then this year, like that machine learning data science feature track also was like encourage people to think about how does generative AI fit into the SciPy landscape. And so like both of those like feature tracks I think were really interesting and like relevant to like industry. We had like a lot of people talk about Rust, which was kind of like cool in different ways. Like when would you use Rust and when wouldn't you use Rust? And like I thought that was kind of like a cool talk. And like, in the Gen AI place like track, like there's some like really interesting talks about like, where people are using it and why they're using it and stuff like that. And so like I think that like even though like there's the Sci and SciPy is important, you're bringing like all the methods that we learn in like the sciences or whatever, a lot of them are applicable in business and industry. We have a really strong tutorial track, which is like awesome. It happens before the conference. And so that's like another great place to like bring people to like actually get hands-on experience with some of these like new packages and like be able to talk to the developers about like, sort of like what's going on and like how they can like leverage it. So I think there's like a lot of opportunity from a business perspective. It's like obviously you're not gonna like go there and like come out with like how to make a business model that like makes you money instead of makes you sad, but like you'll get kind of like the sort of technical topics that are like really relevant to your data teams.
What advice do you have for folks coming from academia, mostly astronomy type fields, trying to get into data and data science and those kinds of careers?
One of the most powerful ways to get your foot in the door is to have connections. And it's like there are different ways you can do this, but like if you're presumably like part of astronomers and data scientists, or like you're interested in like this group, you probably know somebody or know somebody who knows somebody. And so getting people to refer you is like a really important, I think, tool to like actually get, your resume noticed. And this is true not just like when you're first starting out, but like even looking at jobs at whatever level. Like when I joined Twitter, it was through a referral, for instance. Mozilla was a cold call from them to me, which was kind of like interesting, but I think that that's like less and less true today, right? It's like referrals are kind of like really like the way that things are going. And there are lots of ways to like meet people. It used to be everybody like tell everybody like make a data science blog, and that's like kind of true. But like I think it's like knowing people is like really important. Having like, something to like kind of show people is important. It's like less important to like have it something on WordPress, I think. I think the other thing too is like, so the way that I learned statistics and like kind of, I'd say like guerrilla stats. Like I learned like what I needed to know when I needed to know it, but it wasn't necessarily part of like a larger like sort of theory of statistics. And so it's sometimes like a little bit helpful, especially in interview loops, to learn a little bit more of the formal statistics that you might be asked, because like it's not that they're like unrelated, but they might be using different terms. And like depending on the skill of the interviewer, they can help guide you through that or not. Right. And so I think something that like maybe people don't grok in their first job, but like I think after it's pretty obvious. Being good at interviewing is a different skill than being good at work. Sometimes they're related, sometimes they're absolutely not related. Some people are excellent interviewers, but like the day-to-day in and out of like working is like not their strong suit, versus other people are just like awful interviewers, but like they're really hard workers, they're like quick to catch on, they can get contacts. And so I think like being able to kind of like anything you can kind of do to get like an advantage in that regard is like important. The standard for people still like in whatever is like take linear algebra, know that. But like also I think the other important thing too is like being able to like speak about things is important. And so like what you can do to like kind of like learn how to communicate actually ends up being like a superpower, I think. What was like the kind of best advice you've heard in these conversations you've been having?
I mean, communication definitely comes up a lot, right? Being a clear communicator is just, yeah, super powerful. People have their own emphasis, whether they put it on stats or coding or whatever, machine learning, et cetera. But yeah, communication and networking, right? Those are the things I
Yeah.
think that come up the most.
Yeah, as well as other transferable skills that we learn as we do astronomy that we can apply in industry.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Anything else you'd like to share with the audience?
The, the SciPy conference will be putting out a CFP at some point, hopefully before the end of the year. And I think it's like a really great conference to go to because like it's like a really welcoming community, which I think is like awesome. There are a lot of like former astronomers. It was really funny last year. We always have a BOF for like SciPy next year, and so somebody was like making this like kind of comment about it's like, I'm sitting here in a room full of people with astronomy PhDs. And I looked around and I'm like, oh my God, you are. There are like a lot of astronomers that go, and a lot of people who've made the transition from like academia to industry. And so like I think that's like a great place to kind of like meet more like-minded people, make connections. And we always love newcomers. So it's like a really important thing for the SciPy conference is to like welcome new people. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Julie, for joining us.
Thanks for
And
having
thanks.
me.
Yeah, and thanks everyone for listening to this episode of the Astronomers Turned Data Scientists podcast. Please like, subscribe, and share so that you can find out when we release future episodes.
Thanks everybody for listening. We'll catch you next time.